Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to organizers for the invitation. I almost got lost as I listened to Professor Dłubacz's presentation, erudite speaker. He is the author of a book about the absolute in Aristotle. So those of us who encounter discussions and doubts of secondary school students about the absolutes and its importance, I would refer to that specific book of professors, and I recommend it highly. I take the opportunity, as I am to speak about paideia. It so happens that right up front we have the Professor Skrzydlewski and Nowakowski and Professor Ptaszek, the periodicals reviewers. So let me do a sort of crypto advertisement of paideia, an annual publication. So this is a regular publication that's devoted to classical education. So I would recommend that. Over 200 texts altogether to date, 3,000 pages. Dear ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction, this was by way of introduction. I'd like to also explain myself as to why I wish to speak about classical paideia and ask the question whether non-classical paideia can exist, if we mean by it integral system of upbringing education. Then some modern educational models do not fulfill it, even though they correspond with it. They are based on reductionisms and anthropological errors and gradually move away from arithology. I can say that pedagogical theories without truth about man are dominant. And as I look at the nature of paideia, I'd like to point to its connection with classical philosophy, which, according to Świeżewski, is philosophy of substance rather than relevance, as contemporary philosophy would have it. I deliberately omit discussion on the term classical means, which is not a clear-cut definition. Mr. Ziemiec has noted that right at the beginning. Hence, this is being used quite arbitrarily in humanities. Classical philosophy encompasses the Antiquity and Middle Ages, as it continues through Neo-Thomism of Etienne Gilson, Mieczyslav A. Krąpiec, and recently past Professor Mieczysław Gogacz. My purpose is to discuss paideia in light of classical philosophy, pointing to effects of upbringing and education, leading to perfection and even sanctity. I will therefore point to various constituents of paideia. Well, what is it? Paideia, from the Greek pais, the child, is formation of a man from early age through education and upbringing, the universal basis of education, or the ideal developed by ancient Greeks, recognized as universal. And this is related to arete, which was shaped at different levels of human existence, as chivalric valor in Homer, ethos of working the land and shepherding and sense of justice, as Hesiod would have it, and democratic virtue available for those who want to develop it in Solon, and kalakokagatia, the idea of beauty and goodness in Plato, and magnanimity in Aristotle. The goal of paideia is to perfect man and to ensure that it develops with integrity in line with the rational nature. A reason for the Greeks is the basis of understanding reality. It's logicality and order, which translates into human conduct, morality, politics, economics, education. Reason governs actions of nature because it's the most important, one of the most important faculty to intellect, which is superior to senses and effects, and to biological and reproductive processes, which is faculty, motor faculty, vegetative faculty. Intellect is responsible for knowing reality, which is most important goal of man, according to Aristotle, and even something divine, as Plato would have it. We arrive at truth and goodness. Philosophy, thus, is not possession of wisdom, but rather research, search for it and discovery of it. Man, a human being, arrives at it by cultivating their intellect, developing faculties, excellence, arete, that shape their character and distances them from desires and drives that violate nature and intellect. Paideia, ancient Greeks conceived two terms, paideia and pedagogia, and pedagogike. It is without intellectual recognition, if we are driven by our emotions, we will take those paths without checking whether they are positive for us. So the Greeks have coined two terms referring to paideia. First one is pedagogia, and the second is pedagogike. Both derive from pedagogos, the one who leads a boy, being the slave leading boys of free citizens to palestra, the place where they practiced gymnastics. They wrestled not because only for health and bodily aesthetics, but for religious reasons. They hence worshipped the Olympian deities. Physical education and thus the military training contributed to emergence of profession of the pedagogue. The Greek world did not only care about young persons' physical development, but also according to his spiritual development. According to Stefan Kunowski, education is the means used by human society to preserve and transmit physical and spiritual character. He adds that infinitely more important and richer possibilities are held within the human spirit, the prospects of spiritual development. Hence, pedagogy is a skill of shaping, upbringing, and teaching, a set of educational activities and skills which become art of the arts, as it works, manifests itself in striving for independence. And parents notice this. A child wishes to be independent and undertakes various actions, even before they are fully prepared to make choices of truth and goodness. I lost myself. Pedagogy is a technique or methodology of dealing with children and young people, which can be passed on to others through training future teachers. Hence, in this sense, pedagogia is closer to paideia than pedagogika, although these arts and techne were interwoven for the ancients. Such arts as painting, sculpture, dance, construction, carpentry, medicine, politics, rhetoric, grammar, and philosophy. In the Middle Ages, analogous or equivalent understanding of the arts can be found in Richard of St. Victor, Peter Lombard, John of Salisbury, and many other medieval thinkers. And Greek paideia is not merely limited to learning of a trade or a craft. It's about cultivation of the soul, of kalogarthia, generosity. Paideia, therefore, patches up the deficiencies of human nature. Man's upbringing must be adapted to the nature of being, and it is accomplished through teaching, didaskalia, learning, mathesis, and exercise, askesis, whereby things learned become a human second nature. As we say, habit is our second nature. Aretes, such as fitness, virtue, bravery, and enduring disposition, can become such a habit through which a man chooses truth and goodness. Hence, in arete, we have the catalogue includes principles of cognition, knowledge, wisdom, skills, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude. I would emphasize again that classical philosophy assumes that paideia encompasses the entire person and consists of cultivating their potential. Therefore, the substantial form and body, and this is Gorgacz's, Professor Gorgacz's definition, a real existing individual entity, spiritual and corporeal agent who enters relationships and is determined by the qualities he possesses on account of his exercise and his essence, existence and essence. Thus, classical paideia encompasses existence of the person, soul, and the body, personal relationships. In this way, paideia becomes education for the sake of love, freedom, truth, goodness, sovereignty, agency before the law, and if a person wishes, also religious education. Consequently, the vision of a man also impacts moral philosophy, ethics, as well as economics and politics. What are the philosophical foundations of paideia? As is well known, between 4th and 3rd century, paideia ceased to be just a domain of poets and became the province of philosophers. Paideia and subsequently pedagogy shared the uneasy history of philosophy, ups and downs. And sophists brought paideia into materialism and moral relativism, which Socrates and Plato warned against as they strove to redirect it toward idealism and orphism. This, in turn, is overturned by Aristotle with his realistic metaphysics. Paideia's most important philosophical starting points include the dispute between realism and idealism, second, dispute over what man is, and then dispute between nature and culture, and the dispute over arithology and protection of man, and the dispute over political theory and a philosophy of civilization. And I will only outline this in my statement. There are specialists such as Professor Skrzydlewski who deals with philosophy of civilization. So firstly, the triumph of realism, a rejection of and epistemological and metaphysical. So that's the primary reality, and only secondarily we are conscious of it. So that sensory cognitive faculties are imprinted. Metaphysical realism, on the other hand, proclaims that existence is independent from thinking. It should be added that at the level of classical paideia, we are moving to or based on critical realism. So realism assumes that thinking is more important than external objective reality, and that enables its subjectivization. The term realism, even in 19th century, was used to describe various idealistic philosophies in order to emphasize their internal opposition, for example, to the German idealism. But that did not make idealism into realism. Professor Gogas would always cite the example. If you pour a glass of milk into a puddle, the puddle remains a puddle. So in a sense, we have hollowing and relativization of the term. So the attempts undertaken since Middle Ages of reconciling idealism and realism were a fiasco. We had attempts to do so through Arioism, Suarez, Józef Schelling, Bronisław Trentowski, and others. Also Marxism as materialism, dialectic materialism, supposed to be a realistic philosophy while it remained only an ideology. Idealism, it seems that these neologisms, the first one 1870 and the other one came up in 1796, somewhat earlier, this idealism has several iterations: materialism, spiritualism, Cartesian rationalism, and postmodernism. And secondly, the existential view of man, definition of man speaks about integral improvement. So man's potentialities stand out. In metaphysical terms, existence is already there, substantial form, whereas here it's not about just the existence, but the ethical. So the objective here is the cultivation of the perfection, intellectual and other. Improvement of intellect is formation, not deformation or defect. A man has deficiencies in knowledge, corrected by science, in action, ethics, and in production, art, and in touch with transcendence, with personal God. This is religion. The most important activities are responsible for this process are intellect and human will. They can become tools for disintegration and deformation of a person. This brings us to the issue of anthropological era. This appeared in the teaching of John Paul II in the Centissimus Annus encyclical of 1991, number 13. Some years later, Andrzej Maryniarczyk, one of the metaphysical philosophers, he expanded on this papal encyclical on contemporary metaphysics. And he says that formation of false ideology, social political system, socialism, and he proposes integral humanism, humanism that is not in the service of some ideology, but truly reflects full image of human person. So we cannot allow for propagation of erroneous conceptions of man, which result in philosophical errors of reductionism. As historian of philosophy, it seems to me There is no time or place to look at all of the concepts of a human person, but we can collect them into 5 key ones. This includes materialist, second, spiritualist, which is Orphic, Platonic, third, hilomorphic, Aristotelian, in other words, fourth, integral, Thomistic, and fifth, variabilistic, postmodern, the one that's linked with irrationalism, so popular today. The first assumes that a man is just matter, body, system of drives, aggregate of parts. It is a mechanical approach to man, in which the phenomenon of man's spiritual life cannot be fully explained. Additionally, this is characterized by instrumental, utilitarian approach to man, behaviorism. This error is to be overcome by the second concept, Orphic vision of man as a soul, spiritualized, angelic being, which is confined to a body. Consequently, it naively ignores the importance of what is corporeal in man, and relativism is being forced. The concept of inborn feelings. Finally, Aristotelian anthropology, which breaks through the two limitations, and it assumes that man is unity of spiritual and corporeal. The most important power in man is his intellect, and hence man's actions should be permeated by reason. It is impossible to disagree with this. However, does the loss of or lack of reasonableness mean that we are no longer human, cease to be human? This problem has not been fully worked out by Aristotle. But then the fourth integral concept of man of Aquinas seems to overcome this problem. Man is not just function or activity, because human transcends cognitive and volitional acts. He is sovereign and can fully achieve their humanity by discovering and developing their nature, by establishing personal relationships and deciding. So here we have the a revolution in metaphysics, but also paideia and ethics. If history of philosophy textbooks we read that Kant introduces a revolution, this is a great simplification, because it is Thomas Aquinas that introduces that revolution initially. So human being in this concept, the final concept, postmodernist, introduced that human being is in irrational, lacks identity. It is quite popular recently, but doesn't answer the question of who man is. Its corollary is relativism, acceptance of lack of principles, and voluntarism. Denies rationality of man and his cognition. Man in this concept can be freely, subjectively shaped, fashioned in any way. There is a danger of abuse of man because this alludes to ideology and utopia. Third, the dispute at the level of understanding of nature and culture, we have three various concepts. Nature, which is not completely corrupt and evil, Thomas Aquinas. Opposition to Martin Luther, who says nature is completely corrupt and evil, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and liberalism. Nature is good, while the source of evil is culture. And realism view, culture is supposed to make up for nature's deficiencies, and hence man is perfect, should not require education. So so usefulness instead of truth, lack of constraints, use instead of love. Professor Gogacz wrote about it, as well as Jean-Paul II. In a realistic approach, culture is to fulfill the lacks of nature. So it's a tool that can be good or ill-used. A human being is not perfect, so they should tend to beauty, truth, and goodness. Aquinas writes about 4 wounds of human nature after original sin: weakness, ignorance, malice, and covetousness. He adds about loss of moderation, beauty, and order as a result of sin. And then bringing back this harmony is the task of classical paideia. Fourth, paideia, there is this dispute about arithology and protection of persons on the grounds of ethics, thus distancing itself from modern axiologies, which do not always promote patterns according to rational nature of man, ultimately impossible to achieve or devoid of goodness. Goodness, into putting it into a hierarchy of decent, useful, or pleasurable good. And this fifth, there is the discussion about the community. Paideia requires a proper personalistic environment of communities and Latin civilization, which protects a man from socialism, communism, Nazism, fascism, anarchy, liberation. Non-personalistic and not protective of a human being. Teleology of paideia. Every action, according to Aristotle, points to something. For example, a lazy man in a poem of Brzechwa wants to kill his time. A man's goal is to achieve perfection, which is natural and written into the wise existence. The art of upbringing is to form, as Arkadiusz Robaczewski writes, it is ability to direct one's own life, ability to control variety of circumstances, and the preservation of sustained pursuit of goodness, culminating in attainment of fullness of the good, God. And this is also at social level, this expresses itself in human personal connections, decisions, culture, and civilization. The basic direction of education is truth and reality. Today, young people have a problem of being enclosed in virtual world. We therefore need to distinguish between the means leading to an end from the end itself. This is not so obvious in today's postmodern culture. According to Jacek Woroniecki, probably under the influence of Latin perficere, perfectio, we formed the word perfection, which means state of accomplishment, of bringing some activity to its proper end and goal. Perfect is what has been accomplished, and accomplished in such a way that it can efficiently serve the purpose for which it was intended. Any work, then, is considered accomplished when it has been fulfilled not in an inferior manner, but as it should be, as demanded by the purpose it is intended to serve. This is why only then can we say this is done perfectly. It is no different with human life. In order to be brought to completion, as it should be, perfectly, it should reach the goal for which it was intended. Only then can it be called perfect. That's a quotation from Jacek Woroniecki. Friar Woroniecki follows Aquinas, adds that perfection is not only connected with attainment of happiness, but it is obligation of the human soul vis-a-vis the Creator who's called it into existence. Hence, we cannot stop at nature and our ethology, but also points to grace and spiritual life, ascetics, mysticism, mysticism study, pointing the path of purification, enlightenment, and union. In the 5th volume of Paideia, we will have published a manuscript, unpublished manuscript, previously unpublished manuscript of Woroniecki, which is a commentary on Thomas Aquinas's Summa. Paideia as education. It is not sufficient to just educate, but also to upbring. Otherwise, we will have a wildling. This process of separation of the two has been done since the Enlightenment. Since Arthur Schopenhauer, human life is driven by blind desires. Pestalozzi, Froebel, Max Stirner, John Dewey, Jean-Paul Sartre have analogous views. But Narski divides modern pedagogy into the pediocentrism, liberal pedagogy, which consists of hedonism, Cartesian rationalism. This is different from Thomistic intellectualism, and vitalism and naturalism, Hobbes. Then secondly, heterocentrism, which is totalitarianism, Hegel, Fichte, Marx. Alternative here is the Christian, third one, Christian pedagogy, which is opposed in contrast to the earlier two. Classical paideia is not a naive, overly pessimistic or optimistic proposal. It is realistic, taking into account human nature. Achievement of perfection is difficult but possible. Difficulties arising from the very nature of man and the modern culture, which is not conducive to contemplation and wisdom, these difficulties need to be overtaken. I have one more minute to touch on my final conclusions. Paideia is therefore necessary. It introduces man into the world of culture and allows them to creatively develop their essence, establish personal relationships with others. Let us not succumb to the myth of man, that man is perfect, he doesn't need education and can always improve and learn something good. Let me summarize quickly and say that the masters of the Middle Ages, such as Buddha says, if we stand on the shoulders of giants, we can see much more than they themselves saw. And there are these giants that we can get there. Jacek Woroniecki, Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, Krąpiec, Gogacz, Kiereś, Barbara and Henry. As a consequence, we need to measure up to this at education, against negation of the truth, beauty and good, normal, ethicy, without realism, with practicism, loss of reductionism, which leads to reductionism education, with the phenomenon of subjectivism, irrationalism, in other words, the negation of logos, with consumerism, with reductionistic understanding of freedom as self-will, and destruction of actual authorities, with cultural Marxism, deconstruction, and destruction of traditional communities, family, school, and church. Thank you very much for your attention.